Today's video is about theses, which is plural for thesis. A thesis is a statement or theory that is put forward as a premise to be maintained or proved according to the Oxford English Dictionary. So we're going to talk about how to write a thesis, how to make it a good one. So some common questions that come up about thesis statements. First, one of them is, what is the reason for a thesis statement? In a nutshell, a thesis statement, the point of one is to let your readers know where you're going. It's sort of like a roadmap. You can think of it as pointing to a destination. So it says, here's where I'm headed, right? And it gives your reader an idea of where you're going. Without a thesis statement, it's like sending someone out the door and telling them to get in their car and just drive aimlessly, and they don't know where they're going. They may enjoy the view, but they don't know where you're headed. So you want a thesis statement to give your readers an idea of where you're going. Is it an absolute must? No, it's not. It depends on the genre that you're writing in. You don't need a thesis statement in more creative works. The more formal works tend to have thesis statements. So it depends on what you're writing and what your purpose is. But if you'd like your reader to know where you're headed, then you will want a thesis statement. Does it have to go at the end of the first paragraph? Absolutely not. It does not. Thesis statements can go anywhere where they feel natural. You want them to be early enough to give your reader a sense of where you're going. But you can send them out the door and let them wonder for a little while where you're headed. You just don't want to wait too long. So all thesis statements, if they're really effective, they're going to have two parts. I call them the what and the so what. So the what is the content of your paper, what your topic is about. You want to clearly let the reader know the breadth and depth of your paper. So the breadth is how much of a topic you're going to talk about, and the depth is how deep you're going to go into it. Shorter papers will have less breadth and less depth, and longer papers will have more breadth and more depth. The so what is the second part of a thesis. And this second part lets the reader know the answer to why the what matters, why it's important. If you read a thesis and then you feel the urge to say, so what, then the statement is missing this component. So a thesis statement should clearly indicate the reason that you are writing about whatever it is you're writing about. So that's the second part. So here's some examples of an original and a revised one. It's the original. The language has impacted me immensely throughout my lifetime, especially the language in hip hop. This is a common type of thesis statement, but it's missing that so what. It's like, so why do I care whether or not the language in hip hop has immensely impacted you? The second one is more gives us more of an idea of why it's important. The language and music has impacted me as a bridge to my soul and to others. So this is that so what part. Here's another example. Being literate gives me the ability to share stories and thoughts with others. And that is nice, right? But it's missing that so what. Why does that matter? Being literate gives me the ability to share stories and thoughts with others so I can make my influence felt by the rest of the world. So that adds that second part, that so what, to help readers know why this is an important topic to discuss. Okay, so some things that an effective thesis is. An effective thesis is worth thinking or arguing about. You want to avoid things that are not worthy. Frankly, your whole paper should be worth thinking or arguing about, so that by the time your reader is done reading, they have that, I never thought about it that way, sort of a reaction. So it should be thoughtful. We write for reasons, and your reasons should be clear, and they should be worthwhile. An effective thesis also is clearly worded without ambiguous language. You need to be careful of certain terms that can be argued about in and of themselves. So, for example, if you say, burning the flag is unpatriotic, you have to be able to define what it means to be patriotic first. And if you don't talk about what it means to be patriotic and you make that assumption that you and the reader are on the same page, then you're going to have a very difficult time proving your point. So you want to make sure you avoid that kind of language in a thesis and that your main point is not ambiguous. The third thing, an effective thesis is an arguable opinion that can be supported with evidence. So you want to avoid things that are not something that can be argued, statements of fact and opinion and those sorts of things. They preferences, those all should be avoided. I'll explain that in more detail a little later. So a thesis is not. A thesis is not so broad that there's no point. You don't want to argue that the Second World War had an impact on our economy. That couldn't even fit into a book. That would take a volume, several volumes of a book. So you want to keep your thesis narrow enough to be doable in the amount of pages that you are shooting for. You want to avoid statements of personal preference. A good thesis statement doesn't say something like, I really like the rain, or I think chocolate is the best ice cream flavor. These are not thesis statements. They are preferences, and they're not something that you would write a paper about. You also want to avoid arguing obvious things like racism is bad. I think pretty much everyone would agree. So you want to find the nuances and the complexities of racism and choose one of those rather than arguing something really pretty obvious. You also really want to avoid words that are called hedging words. I believe, I think, I feel. A thesis statement should be a statement that you believe firmly enough in order to argue it throughout your paper. So you want to avoid these kinds of things right here. You also want to avoid statements about what you're going to write. A thesis statement should not say, in this paper, I will, blah, 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 okay? The only time that really is acceptable is if you have an exceptionally long paper. And by exceptionally long, I mean maybe over 30 pages. Might be okay, but if you're not in that range, you don't need to tell your reader what you're going to do. Just do it, okay? The next one, arguing simple matters of fact. You want to avoid things like the elephant is the only animal with 4 knees. That's not something you can argue. That's just a statement, and it's true, and so that's not a thesis. You also want to not have an entire paragraph. Sometimes thesis statements can get a little long, but they shouldn't be so long that they become 3, 4, 5 sentences and turn into a thesis paragraph. A thesis should be succinct and straight to the point. It should be it should have that sort of a, in a nutshell kind of a feel, right? So that's what you want to go for. Okay, a thesis might be early in a paper or later in your paper or even last. So it depends on the effect that you want in your paper. So if you want early in the paper, it's like giving your reader your destiny, and say destination, sorry, not destiny, your destination is saying this is where we're headed. If you have it in the middle of your paper somewhere, it's like I'm going to give you a little bit of mystery and then I'm going to tell you where we're headed and then we'll get there together. Having it last is tricky, but it can be really effective if your organization is really good, your topic sentences are really clear, and you indicate something in your introduction that lets readers know pretty clearly what your topic is and what direction they're headed in sort of a vague sense. But your main point, you can work on getting there together with your reader. Okay, so the next point. Your thesis could be 1 sentence or 2 or possibly even 3. So the idea that a thesis statement has to be 1 sentence is not correct. It's a statement, and a lot of statements are more than 1 sentence, right? So think about how you want to word it. You can sometimes have a dependent and independent clause so that it's not 2 sentences and that it's 1. But either way, you don't want it to get too long, right? You want to avoid the paragraph thing. Lastly, a thesis might be a statement or a question, which is called a thesis question, which is obvious, right? But a thesis question is a thing. You can, instead of making it as a statement, you can begin your paper with a question, and you and the reader can work on answering that question together as you work through your paper. It's a very effective way to do a research paper, actually. So if you're writing a research paper, you can start with your research question, and you and your reader can find the answers to that question as you go through your paper. So a thesis question can be really effective, especially in research. So here's a couple of good examples. So the first one is a paper about bullying. Bullying has extended far beyond school and into cyberspace, even though these acts of aggression take place outside of school boundaries. And here's the thesis. School officials should have the authority to discipline students who engage in cyberbullying without fear of reprisal. That is the what, okay? Doing so will help improve the online behavior of students and increase incidences of cyberbully-related suicide attempts. I'm sorry, decrease. Kind of an important part there. And this is the so what, right? And that, so this is 2 sentences, but it's still a really good and clear thesis. Here's another one about legalizing marijuana. Because marijuana has numerous medical applications, such as treating symptoms of epilepsy, cancer, and glaucoma, legalizing the use of marijuana in the U.S. will greatly benefit the medical sector by giving physicians access to this life-saving drug. So this is both the what and the so what put together. Right? The what is legalizing the use of marijuana in the U.S. That's the what. And the so what is because it will greatly benefit people. Okay, so both of these are good examples of thesis statements that have an arguable opinion. They don't have vague terms, and they have both the what and the so what. And that's all I have about thesis statements.